Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by survivingbreastcancer.org. I'm Laura Carfing, breast cancer survivor and founder of survivingbreastcancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations, where we are going to dive into the science, the humanity, and the hope behind every cancer story. Today's episode is going to challenge how you think about treatment. What if cancer wasn't a one-size-fits-all? What if every decision, from the drugs you take to the supplements you choose, was tailored to your own biology? My guest, Dr. John Oertle, Chief Medical Director at Envita Medical Centers, has spent over 25 years pioneering a truly personalized integrative approach that merges precision oncology, functional medicine, and technology. We'll explore why some people respond to treatment while others don't, what circulating tumor DNA can tell us about recurrence, and how understanding environmental toxins and genetics can literally change your odds. So grab a notebook, because this episode is full of those aha moments you'll want to share with your friends and family. Let's dive in. Welcome to the conversation.
My name is Dr. John Oertle. I'm the Chief Medical Director of Envita Medical Centers. And we have been pioneering treatment of precision medicine, this model of designing care around individuals. And we'll get into more about what that actually means for the last 25 years, though. And so all of our protocols is using the best of the data and the technology to be able to say, how can I actually evaluate what's going on with your body, your specific condition, your environment, all those root causes, and really pairing treatment that's designed around the individual, not just a population study. And so this becomes really exciting for us. And when it comes to what we've been doing, we've been pioneering this, like I said, for the last 25 years. But even in the work we've been doing, we're just seeing some amazing results when it comes to being able to treat people as individuals and not just treat them as a one-size-fits-all number when it comes to oncology. And so we've been doing this, and about 80% of our population flies in from outside of Arizona to be able to receive care. We're located in Scottsdale, Arizona, where we're at. We, again, are happy to be able to serve, majority of cases are coming outside of Arizona from within our country, but we also have some international patients as well. About 20% are flying in internationally to be able to receive this personalized, customized approach that we've been pioneering for the last 25 years.
Yeah, amazing. So many ways that we can take this conversation. I already have a million questions I want to dive into. So first, can we rewind 25 years ago? Because I feel like someone, whether it was you, your team, the people at Envita, had this idea, this novel idea that there is not this one-size-fit-all approach. Though I do feel like in the last maybe 5 years, this is becoming much more mainstream in conversation today. So can you give me a little bit of history around the organization and kind of the up and coming of In It for the Long Game, really trying to help the survivors here?
Yeah, so it was Dr. Dino Prado who started this 25 years ago, who really had this vision. He's still our CEO. He's still a part of the actual team and is involved in the data technology. But it was really his vision that said, I want to make sure people are not dying unneededly when data and technology is available, that I want to make sure that these treatments, that our patients have access to the latest of data available so that people don't die unneedingly. And so this is really what started going into this ability to be able to say, how do we really look at data in a new way? And even back 25 years ago, it's unfortunate. You see all this data and research that's poured into oncology. And yet, I feel like, again, even though there's so much data poured into research, are patients able to access that care today and that technology today? And this is what we've started to see is that, we're pretty much, again, I always like to say we're about 5 to 10 years ahead of the curve before when people are starting. So when we're doing precision in 2015, as you're mentioning, we're starting to finally start to do some precision, in some testing. These are not some of the tests as well. I mean, it's a good example. Like some of the tests we use are not, this is not, we use some really latest technology, but some of the tests, like say, for instance, CT-free DNA. What is this? This is cancer DNA that's floating around in the bloodstream that's coming from your actual cancer. It's a great marker to be able to use. But many times people have been more aware of this technology in this lab in obstetrics and gynecology when it comes to you can run a blood test on mom and know exactly the DNA of baby.
Mm.
Again, many of your listeners who have been pregnant in the last literally 15 years have been offered this test and probably have done this test with their actual through their pregnancy. And yet this is something this is a standard of care in oncology and or in obstetrics, but somehow in oncology, because more data, and we can talk more about that, oftentimes is not being offered to patients. This is where we want to be able to utilize more data to be able to make these life-threatening decisions. And this is really what we've been continuing to fight for as far as this ability, not waiting for an insurance company to be able to cover the treatment or cover the diagnostic, but really make sure patients' lives are worth it and worth fighting for. And so this has really been what we've been incubating over the last 25 years to design protocols and making sure that when we run data, that we develop the treatment protocol that's around the data that we actually find.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. A little bit of history to get us up to speed to where we are today. You mentioned earlier that people from all over the country and perhaps the world are flying in to get access to this data, to this type of personalized treatment plans. So is this really just like a blood test that people are coming in for? Can you tell me a little bit more about the data that you're collecting from the patient?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So what we actually are doing, we're running DNA of the blood test, or we're running blood, looking at the DNA that's showing up of the actual cancer in the bloodstream. We're looking at cancer cells that are floating around in the bloodstream. These are oftentimes considered to be what's called circulating tumor cells, or cells that have broken off from the actual main tumor and are now floating around in the bloodstream. And we can capture that and we can do testing on those cells. We also are looking at not just the DNA or the cancer cells themselves, but we're also looking at what's going on with the immune system, what's going on with the actual tumor microenvironment. So when it comes to the actual tumor itself, and you take a biopsy of this, let's actually evaluate what's happening. There's a term in oncology called heterogeneity, which means that, again, that all those cells are very different. And so you mentioned that even with, there's not a single person's breast cancer that is the exact identical match. What's really interesting that you actually see, it goes even deeper than that it's almost, you have different tumors or even sections of tumors that are not identical matches in the same tumor, the collection, because you're dealing with millions of cells. Even in a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter tumor, very small tumor, you're still dealing with a strong quantity, millions of cells that are present. So my whole point is that those cells have variability. They're different. And so this is where, when you start to look at this is one of the things that's been most difficult, I think, when it came to, I like to say Richard Nixon declared war on cancer back in his presidency back in the 70s. And we're still dealing with people dying of cancer today. It's now the second leading cause of death in the United States, and soon to be overtaking on cardiovascular disease is the number one, because we're seeing the rates of diagnosis of cancer continue to be able to increase. And we're seeing, that the treatment modalities for cardiovascular disease, that we can catch it, we can stent, we can actually provide these life-saving treatments for cardiovascular disease. But we're seeing that oncology, we're still seeing that these rates are continually escaping us, because we still see that this is continuing to improve or still increase. So when I look at this, we want to be able to run, again, these biomarkers. And like I was talking about too, being able to not just run the data of the tumor, but what is your body? How is it signaling? How is your immune system signaling? Because the immune system can either signal that it actually kills the cancer, or it actually can signal that it blocks the cancer, depending upon the immune cells that are signaling, or it can also signal inflammatory responses that could actually grow cancer. So this is where it's a very complex dance when it comes to how that body is moving, how it's actually allowing the cancerous state of the body to continue to grow. We also look at metabolism. How is that actual metabolism of the cells? Is it breathing oxygen? Because a poorly oxygenated environment starts to ferment and then starts to be able to create a cancerous environment. So there's all these different dynamics when it comes to the health of the body. And all of this starts to play a role in how patients do. What's their prognosis? How do they actually respond to care? And so, again, I guess my point is that what I've come to understand in the last even 25 years is cancer is more complex than we ever thought it was. And the more we learn, the more we realize how much more complex it is. And so because of that, just to be on it, just to give your listeners this understanding, there's a reason why this one size fits all approach hasn't beaten cancer yet.
Right.
Early detection is still very helpful to make sure that you're catching it early, but there's a reason why that even with all the latest, we're living in 2025, and yet we still have not been able to beat cancer because it is more complex and you need a complex solution. And so this is where with increased technology, with the increased in testing, and then we also use deep learning models to be able to actually understand this AI deep learning on our data set. We can actually start to develop these models where we can say, okay, personalize the treatment around the individual instead of just this one size fits all approach that everybody gets the same thing.
Oh, fantastic. So deep, so complex. It never surprises me how complex cancer can be, but then just hearing it again and again of like, wow, like you feel like you're making so much steps forward and then like maybe a step back because you're like, oh gosh, this is so overwhelming at the same time. I remember a lot of our team at survivingbreastcancer.org, a lot of our volunteers and advocates attend the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium every year. I remember a couple years ago, like the buzzword was CTDNA. Everywhere you look, every session was like CTDNA. And then I can only imagine all of our advocate friends go to the doctor after San Antonio and was like, I want this test. I've heard about these tests. I need to know, especially if I was diagnosed early stage, I'm concerned about recurrence. I need to know if there's anything else happening in my system because these cancer cells can just be lying dormant for years on end. And we're doing the best. We're following the standard of care. We're trying to maintain perhaps lifestyle changes to maintain, a good BMI and exercise and all of these things that have shown to, decrease risk of recurrence. But a lot of the answers that we were getting were, well, we could do the test, but we don't know what the data is going to tell us. We can do this test and we don't know how to respond to it. So we're just not going to do this. So a lot of deny, if you will, right? And, the it's always so hard. Every patient is going to kind of approach this differently. Some people are like, okay, no problem. Like sometimes ignorance can be bliss. And if we don't know how we're going to respond to it, I don't need to be anxious to know that I have some level of circulating tumor cells floating around that we can't do anything with at this moment. It's a wait and see game. Or I would rather just have more information and, I'm going to pay out of pocket and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to try and get the information. So can you kind of help me bridge this gap of like those conversations that we're hearing and then what you guys are able to do?
I would love to bridge that gap because, again, it's a really important one. I'm always an advocate. More data is always better to be able to make decisions with, right? So this is where, and it can be actually empowering too. So I actually really love being able to run CT-free DNA. There's other tests that are out there too for even looking at this minimal residual disease. So what I'm talking about is that you've had cancer, that maybe it's been treated, or you don't see anything on a PET scan, or you don't see anything on any imaging, depending upon the imaging that you're performing. And yet you're still showing that there is mutated cancer DNA that's still showing in the bloodstream, or you still have what's called circulating tumor cells in the actual bloodstream, meaning that you can actually find dormant cancer cells that are still lying dormant. They're not growing, they're not adhering to tissue, but they're in the bloodstream. Okay, so what do you do with that? I always like to say, one, you're not going to just go onto a chemotherapy regimen or go through chemotherapy because also you got to, we utilize chemotherapy for our active cancer diseases and we try to tailor them directly to the data that the tumor is giving us instead of just everybody gets, a certain regimen depending upon their staging and their type of cancer. But what I'd like to say is that there's so much data that can actually be derived when you have other things besides just chemotherapy that you have as options. There's other diet lifestyle medications, there's other off-label use medications, there's other, again, or metabolic areas where you can actually help to tailor depending upon if this is present. A good example of one of the analysis could be ran is that you have an mTOR. mTOR is a molecule that is found on sometimes this testing. And what does this do is showing that the cancer has a difficult time utilizing oxygen for its energy, and so it's utilizing a lot of sugar. And this is a great example of this is where you want to be able to actually have things to be able to not have any sugar in that scenario, right? There's other cancers that it doesn't utilize as much sugar, right? So it's not as concerning. But other cancers that do, well, this is a really critical thing that could actually guide your ability for your diet and lifestyle to be able to make sure that you're supporting yourself. There's some really amazing herbs that can be done to be able to actually work on that mTOR, the supplements that could potentially be very helpful helpful to be able to hit that molecule. So this is where you can do things to be able to, many times it's not in, I don't want to, discount a lot because I know it's a common experience, I think, for patients who go to see their oncologist and, can you run this test? Can you
Right.
do this?
Test
And
me. I need to know.
there's this lack of, I think, wanting to do it because they don't want to create fear as you're talking about. And then the other thing that I'm also very considerate of is that many times they just don't have the tools. They haven't been trained this. They don't know what to do. And so because it's not in their education, their training, they're left with saying, well, I don't know what to do about an mTOR and what your diet and lifestyle should be as far as being able to help support and serve you, even if this is present. And so for me, it's one of these dynamics where being able to educate, look at providers that know, being able to actually understand and partner up with people that really do have an understanding of this, because it makes a big difference. It makes a big difference. And so because if you do have it present, this is one of those areas too, where again, I always say, well, you want to it changes. There's a couple of things too, is it changes your screening process. It changes for us, what are those diet and lifestyle? It changes how frequently do we actually monitor that? It changes, do we actually run it again next year, or do you run it more frequently to be able to see, is there a trend moving in a bad direction? I always like to say that some of this work, when you're looking at the cellular work and some of those metabolic, DNA that you're looking at, this is on the cellular level, and it's a leading indicator of disease. And give this example, right? How many times people have had an experience where you're going in and it's like, okay, this is the regimen, this is what you're going to get. And then you do imaging to be able to just find out if the regimen that you have been prescribed is going to work. 3 months later, you're going to get a CT scan to see if it's actually working, or you hold off on running your tumor markers, right? In breast cancer, see it in your 27, 29, 15.3, to be able to actually see, you wait on those. We like to say, when you want a leading indicator sometimes to be able to see, okay, is this actually dropping? And you can actually see CT-free DNA drops more rapidly. And when you have a tumor response, then you can actually see it coming into into just imaging alone. I give the other example that, again, something like triple negative breast cancer that's got a very rapid, it's very aggressive most times. It mutates very quickly. And so it finds a way out of those regimens and it can mutate. Those are cancers you want to be able to actually run more frequently, those tests, because it's not just showing if the actual treatment's working or not. You can also be very predictive of, okay, is it starting to mutate now? And if it's starting to mutate on you, with especially these cancers that are they're very mutagenic and they mutate really rapidly. Well, now you can start to shift with the cancer. And so you don't have to just wait 3 months out to be able to figure out that the tumor's actually grown larger. And now you're dealing with a lot more tissue burden or burden of disease, where now you're having to be able to then try then another regimen, right? You're going to say, well, this regimen didn't work, so let me just try another regimen. Where, think about it, is that if you're in the middle of treatment and you're starting to see mutations already, well, now you can shift, and now you're able to say, hold on, I'm going to still run an image, but we're going to run that image sooner, and we're going to start shifting this model because we're already starting to see these mutations starting to occur. Does that make sense? So I think it's a leading indicator of analysis instead of a lagging indicator. And when it comes to timing is everything when it comes to a cancer patient. You want to make sure that you're catching that. I would much rather know that you potentially need, if you have tumor DNA that's floating around in the bloodstream or circulating tumors, you want to keep monitoring that, because you don't want to just have it be silently growing until you develop symptoms or your weight back to be able to just get scanned the very next year, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
no,
So
absolutely.
these are our lives that we're talking about. And so this is why I really want to make sure that finding, again, people that are advocates for themselves. I also will share, this is interesting data that we find, is that 90%, so we see a lot of, we do see some early stage cancer patients. We see a lot of late stage cancer patients, stage 3, stage 4 cancer patients as well. But our data shows that we've actually seen 90% of our patients, when we actually run their biometric data and looking at the DNA, we actually find that there is 90% that are already resistant to the prescription chemotherapy regimen that they've been prescribed. And
Really?
so 90% of the time, so at least in one or multiple chemo agents. I don't like that statistic at all, but this is where I want to be able to use chemotherapies. And we use, again, at Envita, we use chemotherapies, we use off-label use chemotherapies, meaning, again, these are chemotherapies that are maybe prescribed for lung cancer, but you have breast cancer. We see this, you're talking about this precision therapy happening right now in the industry. Keytruda was the first medication approved by the FDA. This is the immunotherapy Keytruda that actually wasn't based upon a tissue type. It was based upon a molecular diagnosis, right? Does that make sense? So I'll go back to that. But this is where, again, just think about many times right now in oncology, I think this is an important concept where oncologists are basing the chemotherapeutic regimen based upon your tissue. You have stage 3 breast cancer. So this is your first line therapies for your stage 3 breast. And maybe it's estrogen receptor positive, progesterone receptor positive, and HER2 positive. That's awesome. And HER2 positivity and Herceptin that was developed was literally one of the first in precision medicine that
Yeah.
was amazing for breast cancer patients because that was a death sentence before that. And this was that, but that's 3 molecules that you're talking about that you now have an option to be able to treat. What if you have other molecules that are present? And this is where, I've seen many patients where that HER2 molecule, I know we're talking about breast cancer, but that HER2 molecule is on colorectal cancer. And guess
Right.
what? Nobody's testing it. And if you're not testing it, you don't know it. But if you find it, then guess what? Herceptin becomes this beautiful treatment that's in place, just like it is for breast cancer patients who have HER2 positivity. And so you treat it as far as that goes. So we do this when it comes to chemotherapies. We use chemotherapies that are off label. And then we also use other drugs as well that are not chemotherapy, but they show an effect for the actual cancer. I oftentimes give this example of, say, for instance, a molecule called MMP. It's called metalloproteinase. This molecule, if it's present on a cancer cell, it invades into tissue and it starts to actually make cells. I give this example that it almost makes cells more sticky,
Mm.
that it allows cells to metastasize, to adhere into tissue and start to spread into tissue. And so there's not a chemotherapy that I know of that actually hits that molecule. But there are other drugs on the market that actually do, like doxycycline, which is an antibiotic, or Celebrex, which is a anti-inflammatory medication that's given for rheumatoid arthritis that helps to silence that molecule. So this is where you start to develop these therapies where you don't want to interact with each other, but you start to develop. This is what we've been the model of when we do combination therapies. We're able to start doing it in concert with each other instead of just a single, I think about it as far as a symphony, instead of just one instrument that you're using to play this incredible complex orchestra music. We're using, okay, what is the music? Tell us. Where's that roadmap? What is the actual roadmap that a patient is needing to play? And then bring in the instruments to be able to play it in concert with each other that actually respects the other systems, the immune system of the body. How does it actually do this? So this is where you want to use all of that. Diet and lifestyle is no different,
Mhm.
And now many times people are like, oh, I've heard of curcumin. 20 years ago, nobody heard of curcumin or turmeric. Unless if you were from India, because the generations and historically, everybody knew about turmeric or curcumin in India.
Yeah.
But now we know that it can have a great effect. I always like to say, though, you still don't want to do a one size fits all, even with your supplements, because I've had molecules where you can actually see the curcumin could potentially be disrupting the treatment, the chemotherapy. And you don't want to have that. But there's other molecules that can present on a cancer cell where they are actually creating a resistance to a chemotherapy. This is in the data. And curcumin helps to remove that allows the chemotherapy to become sensitive to the cancer again. And so that's where these options that start to be able to really make a lot of sense when it comes to you follow the data. And now you start to be able to build these regimens based upon our 25 years of data and experience in putting these combinations together. And you put that with the latest in the data that's coming about and the technology that's available to patients like CT-free DNA. Obviously, that's been around for a long time now. There's other things too to be able to look at that I'm even excited about. But this is where you start to be able to put these together and it starts to actually create a logical plan for the ability of a patient to not be fearful anymore, but can actually be empowered with knowledge that what they're doing has got a good likelihood of actually having success. And then you also, if you don't, then you want to get forth to a program that will have a good fighting chance of being able to respond, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
No, amazing information. And there's two topics I think I want to dovetail from the information you just shared. One is how to utilize off-label drugs, and the second one is supplements. So for someone who doesn't know anything about these off-label drugs, I think as I'm listening to you speak, I'm like, oh my gosh, we just need all these brilliant minds to be in a room together and share information and share knowledge and try and test. But from how does this work in practice? Already approved drugs for another indication, but are these now considered clinical trial type regimens for the patient? Or is there, I guess, what risks do we need to be aware of if these aren't indicated for breast cancer per se?
Yeah, well, I'll share in our models, it's very challenging. I'll just share to be able to have a double-blind placebo-controlled study is very challenging because it's not this is almost where I'll go a little bit deeper here because it's almost this one drug for one sickness doesn't work in oncology. So it's combinations. And when you have very unique, we call it N of one, this study based around the individual, not based upon a population, not just saying that these are the treatments here. Even I'll give this example. I was talking a little about Keytruda, for instance, the PD-1, right? Keytruda.
Mm-hmm.
And now we've seen PD-1 inhibitors. These are cloaking mechanisms that the cancer, these checkpoints that cancer was able to use to essentially be hidden or cloaked from the immune system. So these are great drugs, but they try to remove that cloaking mechanism so that the actual immune system can recognize it. Okay, this is great, but we still see that these molecules I talked about too, how we're seeing this trend to be in more precision. So Keytruda was an example. Now we've looked at it's based upon now a molecule. If PD-1 is now a part of your cancer, PD-L1, right, is a part of that actual molecule, then you're now able to actually have in solid tumors the ability of having coverage for Keytruda or the PD-1 inhibitor to be able to be a part of your regimen. This is great because that was revolutionary. It's not just based upon tissue, it's now based upon a molecule.
Right.
Problem still is, okay, so what happens when only, and this is when you actually take tumor and you run it through, again, we run it through very specialized testing and pathology to be able to look at what is the actual amount of PD-1 that's present on a tumor. Maybe it's only 17% on a single tumor. You can get that drug, but it's going to be less responsive.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so this is where you can still utilize that. But then how do you do this to where you can augment its effects to be able to make sure that the immune system is able to target not just 17% of that tumor, but that you're starting to be able to get the totality of care? Or I give this other example with a lot of people that are oftentimes on these checkpoint inhibitors that your immune system, there's what's called immune exhaustion, right? To be able to say when you're on this immunotherapy, it's starting to be effective, but then over time, your immune system becomes fatigued and exhausted. And now just one drug doesn't do the job to boost up the immune system again, right?
Mm.
So this is where over time, that's what happens. And so when you see this return, well, now you're dealing with, again, I'm here to beat disease.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it.
What are the gaps in care that we are falling short on? Because, there's not a double-blind clinical controlled study to say, how do I now need to improve the immunity to be able to do this through diet, lifestyle, through maybe an off-label use medication that's good data, and then starting to be able to put in a role where it's designed around the patient. I guess this is where what we've done in a sense is we've been incubating these treatments over the last 25 years, looking at data. And so it's all informed consent when it comes to patients that have been coming here, but it's all around this actual ability of saying, we look at the data and we look at being able to do this. And now we have our library of our own data and protocols over the last 25 years that we've built this from to be able to say, wow, these are incredible results when it comes to, if you have this, I'm going to start to add that into it. I'm going to give one more concept because I think this is really good too. But again, just think about, one of the concepts that we have is that to be able to not just choose the right drug, supplement, pharmaceutical agent, or what you're dealing with, not just choosing the right one that's targeted and tailored to your condition, but then you have to ask yourself, is it actually getting to the tumor? Okay, one of the things that I found to be incredibly surprising when I came across this data, this in my early in my career, but we looked at this, and it was that if you give an IV of chemotherapy, how much actually of that drug actually gets to the tumor? Okay, this is such a good question. And this is what blew my mind is that because we knew that it was causing there was a lot of side effects that happen with chemotherapy, but how much of it actually gets to the tumor? And for us, it was okay, even if it's the right med, how much of it is actually getting to the actual tumor to cause an actual effective kill of that actual tumor? The data shows that it's about 5%, 5 to 7% of an IV of chemotherapy actually gets to a tumor. Okay, I'm like, what is going on? How can we increase that? And this isn't even dealing with an oral chemo that has to get through the GI tract to then eventually go through the liver, first pass metabolism to finally get to the site. But in an IV where you get 100% of that drug delivered to the actual bloodstream, about 5 to 7% gets to the actual tumor. This is where we started to be able to look at this and said, okay, how do we actually improve that? We started utilizing various direct injections directly to the tumor. We call it CIPI, chemo immuno precision injection, where we're utilizing these drugs now that have the right genetic target directly to the actual tumors. What does that do now? You can use less dosage at the same, far less dosage and deliver it directly to a tumor. And now you actually have that ability of that actual chemotherapy getting in the concentrations into a tumor in a higher level. It's the right medications. You start to be able to have less symptoms like side effects. You can maintain and salvage your immune system to be able to actually make sure it stays healthy in that fight as you move forward on making sure that everything you're doing is trying to help bolster that immunity and remove those obstacles for that immune system to be able to function to recognize that actual tumor. Those are just a couple of concepts, but I think they're really illuminative to be able to say these are gaps that are currently in our oncology that really has not made the national public discourse that should be discussed because these is moving in a direction where this isn't just, when I get my results that I do, it's because it's come from being able to really look at the data and really fill in these gaps of where we're currently, seeing this missing in the current, that oftentimes people are being just delivered in their current standard of care approach. Those are just my thoughts. Obviously, we've been incubating this in a cash pay model out of Scottsdale, Arizona for these 25 years. We've also started going into employer groups and employer plans because what our data also showed, I wasn't going to mention this, but I think it's important because this is where what we've found is that the data is great when it comes to outcome. But then it becomes how do people access this,
Mm-hmm.
which is a big part of my like, okay, I have this beautiful secret that I feel like we've been continually doing and utilizing and reproducing and having this approach with to be able to bring forth outcomes. But then how do you do this when it comes to actually access for people to access this? What our data was showing, and we were about half, okay, get this, with the data and the outcomes that we had with people flying in, which was great, we were about half the cost of the conventional system when it came to our actuarial data that we ran in 2020. And the reason why, because we were using less dosage of chemotherapy, we were having less side effects. And so all of this ability of having this approach, we were at half the cost. And when that came to our realization, we said, okay, we need to be able to start moving this forward. So now we've had different plans and different employer groups, which again, self-funded and level funded plans that are now flying in and having us a part of their actual oncology programs because you get better outcomes and you have a lower cost. So all of that was this model now that we've been working towards in the last 5 years of saying, how do we provide coverage for
Mm-hmm.
this kind of access to be able to make sure that people have access to this kind of treatment? And so that's been a big part of what we've been doing as well. At the same time, we've been continuing to push forward with outcomes,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Really important questions. And that always seems to be like the chicken and the egg situation of, new approaches coming out and then just going up against the headwinds of how do we get things moved and changing the standard of care to be more innovative and open to some of these opportunities that you guys are presenting at Envita. I want to circle back to the real quick.
I've got something else too that I was thinking it's a good conversation but it's this concept of root cause
Mm,
of being able to analyze, because I know this is where too it's been a passion of mine with, especially within breast cancer, that and there's been a national conversation about maybe some root causes that are going on in medicine right now, and carcinogens in our environment, and what are some of these actual root causes, because everybody knows what a carcinogen is, right? I think all your listeners,
oh, yeah.
I'll define it. What is a carcinogen? But a carcinogen is a chemical toxin that causes cancer. We know this. And this is what I find to be interesting. And this is at least, again, what we do at Envita tries to solve that gap as well. But I always like to say, like, well, okay, so if we know that this concept of carcinogen exists, then why is it that when we actually come down with cancer, why do we not actually run toxicology testing to be
Mm,
able to actually run a full history of where potential exposures are at, and then running toxicology testing to be able to see, do you have these various chemical toxins in the actual system, to be able to actually see, when I see some of my breast cancer patients and we have known pesticides that are known carcinogens that are in the fifth percentile of the population in concentration in a body, I say that needs to be removed. And so we start to be able to actually work on removing some of those pesticides from the tissue, so we can actually start to be able to make sure, always like to say, take the gasoline off the forest fire,
mm,
because if you have this carcinogen in the body and it's signaling cancerous growth and it's suppressing immunity and creating this microenvironment of the tumor to be able to actually be proliferative instead of actually being able to not grow, that's where we've got to be able to also, it's a part of the process, because, and I would say for any of your listeners too, I mean, that's just another area where if you have cancer, please, it's really helpful to investigate where in the world did this thing come from. Because again, we know that potential carcinogens can do this. There was a great study just even last year, we've been looking at, there's a such thing as oncogenic infections. That
mm,
infections that are correlated with, just like many times people are understanding this as far as like HPV, right? HPV causes, it's human papillomavirus, is the cause for cervical cancer. Right.
mm,
And this is where women get gynecology and go to pap smears looking for cellular changes, and then get HPV testing for cervical cancer. I love it. That's been what we've seen, the rates and the drop in cervical cancer. Been the best technology, the best treated cancer that we've seen in the last 20 years is cervical cancer. And now women aren't dying from cervical cancer because they're going to the gynecologist and running HPV testing. And if they have it, they're wanting to be able to keep checking and following that to make sure that it is, it's being removed or cleared. And many times if if you're younger than 30, they're like, well, your immune system's strong enough, it'll just take care of it. If you're over 30, you really want to keep following it, because it may continue to linger and it may be there to be able to cause cancer. But I think this is actually, there's data that these infections are present, not just the carcinogens, the toxins, but infections are present. And we actually see this correlating with breast cancer. One of the recent ones that just came out, we've seen, and we've been tracking this data for a long time clinically, was Borrelia burgdorferi, or Lyme disease. And we're seeing a lot more women coming down with, or just people in general coming down with Lyme and having active Lyme. And this is where too, be able to see that Borrelia burgdorferi on the presence of breast cancer cells. And this came on out. NIH had the actual paper that came on out. And this is so good, because if you have it, guess what? You want to treat it. So this is just and it can change our screening to be able to make sure that protection and prevention, and making sure, just like cervical cancer was treated, and we can actually evaluate that. So I always think, like, what happened before that cervical cancer and HPV gained standard of care? Well, doctors started to learn about this and know about this, but we started to be able to actually implement this into our public health and our screening, and started to be able to make changes. And it took time to actually get it implemented, and taking time, but it's done everything for the actual sake of patients. I think we need to have that same mindset when it comes to breast cancer.
mm-hmm.
It shouldn't just be, let's just get your mammograms are life-saving, no question about it. But there needs to be more detailed observations to make sure that we still have, women are still dying of breast cancer. This should not be the case. We need more detailed biometric data to be able to push forward, to be able to actually make sure that we're able to see it and evaluate it. I mean, I was thinking one of the things I feel like is very encouraging. Did you see that the Duke study that came on out
I don't
looking
think
at imaging and mammography? This is using AI. This was last year that this came on out. Sorry, there's
no.
just so
Please.
much there in this research. The Duke study showed that again, they took radiology and looking at AI programs. And they started seeing that if you actually used AI for mammography radiology, meaning again, all for just mammograms, that you could identify the cellular changes up to 5 years before breast cancer even developed. 5 years. So the cells using AI in the imaging of mammography, cells were starting to change and shift, but cancer had not developed yet. And they were able to say it was a historical study looking at all the films before women actually came down with breast cancer. And so this is where when you start to say, okay, well, this is great. Well, we need to push forward on being able to make sure that we are unapologetically making sure that people are getting the proper screening, the proper diagnosis, the proper treatment. We need to be unapologetic to be able to keep fighting for ourselves and for the very best because people are still dying. And this to me is my life mission to be able to say people do not need to die needlessly anymore. Let's actually use data and technology to be able to actually serve the human person. And let's fight for this because lives are worth it. If that makes sense. So this is where I guess I just see we're living in an advent of so much beautiful data. And
Yes.
yet I think I think it's more the systems the systems that we find ourselves in that are more broken, that don't allow for the best data and analysis to be able to actually get to the tabletop to where, or the patient bed to be able to actually make sure that we're delivering some of this technology for the sake of the service of patients. And so when you do, you see that there's beautiful things that can exist. So those are, yeah, I mean, I love what I do because we're really fighting this battle to be able to really help with humanity. There's
Yeah.
no reason. I just feel like anytime that screening isn't happening or people aren't getting the kind of data to make decisions for themselves or their loved ones, we've got to be able to we've got to fight because this is where it's worth it with outcomes. But then you also see my technology that it's like, well, you can actually have technology be developed and delivered for a fraction of the cost than what we're currently getting now. And that's also where it's like, well, financially, it needs to make sense. We've got to break these barriers of the
Absolutely.
bureaucracy or the system that really
It's
isn't
almost like
serving people
self-imposed.
to
Yeah.
their most effective way possible.
Yes. Brilliant. So one question, so many more questions, but I want to be cognizant of our time together too. So, thinking about like lifestyle changes and the carcinogens, I am curious because I'll just use me as like an example, right? I was diagnosed in my 30s. My listeners know so much about me. It's kind of funny what I share on the public radio, if you will. But I was diagnosed in my 30s. I was a strict vegan for a number of years. I started off being a vegetarian at 16, eventually matriculated onto being a vegan. I was very healthy, athletic, all the right things as we hear very commonly, and still got diagnosed with breast cancer with no genetic predisposition or family history, right? And so you mentioned this idea of understanding our toxicity and, the environmental factors. How would one go about actually asking their doctor, or what type of tests do people get to find out like what's causing this environment? Because a lot of, I think, the standard responses we get is, right, like you'll have 10 to 15% chance if it's genetic mutations. However, what about like the 85% of us that are just like, oh, it's just a fluke and we just have to live with that? So, it's interesting. And I know a lot of people too, we want to meet you halfway. Like you're the doctors, you have the medicine, you have the brilliance. But if I can throw out my toxic like lipsticks and makeup or my chemicals that I'm using to clean my house or the plastics or like all of the things that I'm thinking about, I'm doing my part, that's in my control, but so much is also still out of my control. So how would one go about finding what's in our bodies, I guess?
That's a great question. So I would also say that again, most times you're not going to find this in just your standard of care doctor office, right? This is where there's been this increase in being able to seek out maybe a functional medicine doctor
Mm,
or being able to actually look at who's doing, some further deep dive and analysis, of a functional medicine doctor to be able to actually further evaluate. I'm certainly
I
happy
see.
to be able to make sure that we're able to look at, if you come to Envita, it's one of these areas where we're saying, okay, let's look at your history. What are you exposed to? And then really testing goes from there, as far as this goes. I would also make the recommendation is that if you do, it's time to start actually being aware to be able to say your shampoos, like, beauty products that are carcinogens, start to read labels as far as this goes, because your beauty products, your shampoos, there's, if people are fastidious cleaners, your cleaning products are filled with carcinogens, or maybe again, you clean homes for a living, right? Again, these are all things where you really, it should shift your thoughts to be able to say, I need to be able to really evaluate this further. I always say too, living on a golf course, because you don't know the spraying of pesticides. I've seen this correlative with women as well that live on a golf course, or are female golfers
Oh,
and spend a lot of
interesting.
time on the golf course, have a higher likelihood, depending upon the golf course that they actually golf at and the time of day when they're actually doing the spraying, that you're actually playing golf. A lot of it is that you can look at, it's possible that you have the exposure, but you don't actually fully know that you are until you actually test for it. There's also some genetic variability with how well are we at cleansing the body, so some people have, they just hold on to everything. They're a bit like a sponge, their genetic metabolic ability to be able to cleanse toxin from the actual system is just impaired, more impaired than most. And so you got to be more cautious about that exposure and those kind of patients. There's some people that are incredibly exposed and then they clear and they eliminate really well. I always like to say too, this is where when you talk about weight, again, having a good healthy BMI, a lot of these toxins collect in the fat. And so fatty tissue is almost a reservoir for some of these toxins. Why is it helpful to be able to understand that for breast cancer? Well, because again, the breast is fatty tissue and you can have toxic accumulation specifically in the fatty tissue in the breast. And so this is why is it helpful? Because again, somebody that just loses that weight and gets into a healthy BMI, that can be an incredible detox program to be able to cleanse and clear, because there's nowhere for that fat or those toxins to store. Right. And so this is where that's really helpful too, to be able to actually just make sure that you're not having that healthy BMI, to be able to not have that toxic accumulation. And so this is all, again, it's this finding a doc. I would just say finding a doc that's knowledgeable, doing your own research, because I think we've addressed some really, I think
Yeah.
what I love as far as questions, I just want to make sure that these are questions being asked, discovered. Do your research. We live in now, again, a time where, obviously it's not just Google that you're looking at for education, but ChatGPT or these other AI. They're not perfect. They're not perfect. There still is hallucinations that can occur. This is where you actually
Yep.
start to get falsities in the AI data. Again, they're not perfect, but at the same time, they do a lot of good to be able to direct you in the right direction. So I always say too, again, this is where you do your own research, you be your own advocate. You find practitioners. I always like to say, find practitioners that aren't afraid of your questions,
Right.
that are actually partners with you in that ability to, these are valid questions and you want good answers. You don't want somebody that, is more intimidated by a good question to be able to be asked. I find that, many of these things that we've even talked about today have been questions that have been posed by patients. They've been talking, they've been
Exactly.
discussing, and I'm open to listening and saying, I want to research. If I'm doing something that I can fill in another gap, let's actually move it forward to be able to continue the work, to be able to help support. Many times it is something that I can provide an answer to be able to say, no, we've already looked at that, or we're already doing this in this kind of a
Hmm.
way. But it is something where finding doctors that are really open to being able to listen, being able to actually work with you on that journey. Because these answers actually a lot of these answers are out there. It's just a matter of finding the right doctor to be able that's going to work with you through that. But again, functional medicine docs are, for those reasons, specifically on the toxic side, can be actually really favorable.
Amazing. Amazing. It's all about building the right team, having the right people in your pocket. I always say the more eyes that are looking at my specific case, the better. And I think when I get different opinions from different doctors, that's also really positive because it sparks conversation and other potential future discovery. So it's like, why was one person thinking X, Y, and Z when this other person is saying A, B, and C? And then, you bring in homeopathic doctors and functional medicine doctors, et cetera, and really just, okay, let's have a conversation about it and see what's at the best interest for the patient. So
That's exactly
this
right.
has been such a fun conversation. I am so glad to have you on the podcast, and I hope this is one of many more conversations we can have. Last but not least, how can our listeners find you and get more information if they're interested?
Yeah, if you're interested, my website, Envita's website is envita.com. That's ENVITA.com. Also, if you're interested in any of the actual healthcare plans that we're actually offering to employer groups through any of our healthcare plans, you can go to invitahealth.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, and I hope to have you back soon.
Excellent. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to our show. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast is from personal experiences and is not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always contact your medical care team. If you are looking for specific topics or would like to be a guest on our show, please feel free to reach out. My email is laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. Our show is made possible by our nonprofit, survivingbreastcancer.org, and by our incredible donors like yourself. You can hop on over to survivingbreastcancer.org to sign up for our mailing list, make a donation, and explore the 400 plus programs we offer each year at survivingbreastcancer.org/events. Until next time, keep on thriving.